Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more. Robert had lived with his Aunt Diane now for a year, ever since his mother died, and the final visit from the Social Services and Diane Jones' signature on the last document meant that Robert was now the charge of Diane. Diane Jones knew that her sister would have expected her to look after her son Robert on her death, but to adopt a child now, at her age, Diane felt she would be unable to cope. She had employed a governess to educate Robert, and with the help from Jane the young maid, the three of them managed to restrain Robert's boisterous ways. It was ironic in a way that she was allowed to adopt her nephew when 10 years ago, at the age of 37, she was told that she was too old to adopt the daughter she'd always wanted. Not having ever married, Diane had no children, but she'd always wanted to raise a daughter, and now she was stuck with a 14-year-old boy. Diane was the part owner of a chain of clothes stores and, over the years, had become wealthy enough to take semi-retirement. She now only visited the shop when asked for an opinion or to attend a fashion show, and most of her time was spent socializing, and she did not want her new charge to interfere with that. Over coffee one evening, Diane, Jane, and Helen, the governess, were discussing Robert, who was in bed. "Are you coping with him all right?" Diane asked. "To be truthful, no, I am not." Jane answered. "He runs around all day long and expects me to clear up after him. I don't think I can put up with it much longer. I have difficulty when trying to teach him anything. He has no respect for his elders." Helen stated. "Well, it's time to put our plan into action," Diane said, with a smile, which brought a smile to the faces of both Jane and Helen. Jane went up to Robert's room and quietly, so as not to wake the sleeping boy, removed all his clothes, while Diane and Helen went into the spare bedroom. The spare bedroom had always been locked, but often Robert saw Diane enter, then after 2 or 3 minutes, leave, locking the door behind her. When he asked what was in the room, Robert was told that that room was Jessica's room. Jessica, Robert found out, was the name that Diane would have given to her daughter, had she had one. Robert was woken, at 6:30 a.m., by the sunlight streaming through the window, as Jane drew back the curtains. "What time is it?" Robert inquired, still half asleep. "It's time to get up, Miss Jessica," Jane answered with a gleeful smile. Robert did not have time to ask Jane to clarify her statement, as Jane assisted him to rise from the bed, remove his pajamas, and then lead him, by the hand, to the bathroom. Once in the bathroom, Jane ushered Robert into a highly scented bath. The warmth and aroma of the water woke Robert up, and as he started to rise from the bath, his Aunt Diane entered. "Sit down, Jessica, and let Jane finish washing you," Diane said sternly. "But Auntie, I am not Jessica, I'm Robert," the shocked boy replied, thinking his aunt had lost her mind. "Robert has left us, and you are now my daughter Jessica, and if I have any resistance from you, Robert will not come back and you will be Jessica forever," Diane stated. "You will learn the manners of a young girl, and then maybe, if Robert comes back to us, he will have a bit more respect for his elders. Now get washed and we can get you dressed." Robert had no chance to reply before Diane turned and left Robert and Jane in the bathroom. As Jane washed his body with sweet-smelling soap, Robert noticed that Jane was dressed in a way that he had never seen her before. Her black and white uniform was different. She normally wore a neat, but plain, cotton dress with a white starched apron, but now Jane wore a satin dress with a short full skirt over stiff petticoats, and the apron she wore, also satin, was edged with large ruffles. Upon her head was a white satin cap with ribbons flowing down her black hair. To her Shoulders. She was dressed like the French maid that Robert had seen in the girly magazine hid under his bed. Jane washed his hair and finally Robert was instructed to get out of the bath. He covered his manhood with his hands and Jane smiled warmly as she wrapped a large fluffy towel around his shoulders. Once he was dry, Jane powdered Robert with a perfumed talc, slipped a short white toweling robe over the naked boy and led him by the hand to Jessica's room. As they entered the once forbidden room, Robert saw that it was decorated in a very girlish fashion. A large four-poster bed dominated the room and with its pink satin drapes matching those at the window, it was ultra-feminine. Several dolls in pretty dresses sat on a shelf down one wall of the room, and the mirrored wardrobes on the opposite wall reflected the whole room. Jessica," Diane said, "come in, let's get you dressed." "Auntie Diane, I don't like this, I promise I'll be good," the frightened boy managed to say. "Yes, you will be a good little girl when you have on a pretty dress," Diane replied with a soothing smile. "I'm not wearing a dress," Robert said with a newfound courage. "I am not a girl." A slap across his bare leg shocked Robert, more than hurt him, and his courage deserted him once again. Diane asked Robert if he liked the dolls that decorated the room, and after Robert mumbled a no, Diane asked him why. "Their dresses are silly," Robert stuttered. "And which one do you think is the silliest?" Diane asked. Robert looked at the array of dolls and saw they were all silly but pointed to the doll in the yellow dress. As Jane took the doll Robert had selected from the shelf and placed it on the bed, Diane slid open one of the mirrored doors and brought out an identical, but larger dress. "I think Jessica will look lovely in this, Jane," Diane said, as she laid the dress on the bed. "Yes, Jane said with a curtsy. "Please, Auntie, I don't want to wear a dress," Robert pleaded, but his pleas fell on deaf ears, as Diane instructed Jane to dress Jessica ready for breakfast. Diane left the room, leaving Jane to dress Robert in the dress that lay on the bed, but instead of being tugged and forced into the dress, Jane sat on the bed and held Robert's hand. "I'm sorry, Robert," Jane quietly told the boy, "but I think your aunt has gone insane. She is now insisting that I wear this ridiculous uniform and I have to curtsy and say yes man no more I will be sacked, and sniff you are to become sniffer Jessica." And Jane started to cry. Robert held her hand tightly, feeling sorry for the young girl, not realizing the outburst was a well-rehearsed ruse to gain the trust and cooperation of the young boy. Jane told Robert that if she was unable to cope with his transformation into Jessica, then Diane would dismiss her and employ a stronger woman who could. Robert insisted that he would not dress like a girl and he was going to run away. "She would catch you within the hour. Unless," Jane started. "Unless you wait till she goes to her office in London." Robert began to listen intensely to Jane's plan. "If you act out the part of Jessica, she will trust you, and next week, when she is attending a fashion show in London, you can make your escape." Jane continued. "But I will have to wear a dress. Only for 6 days, then you can escape," Jane answered, and explained the details of her plan. Robert began to see the logic of Jane's plan. Diane's house was out in the country, 6 miles from the nearest village, and Diane was a well-respected member of the community. She had friends in the village who would assist in the search for Robert should he run away. But if she did not know of the escape, Robert could keep on traveling until he reached Aberdeen, 30 miles away. Once there he could get a job or just live on the streets. Reluctantly, Robert agreed to wear the silly dress. Jane thanked Robert for letting her dress him and therefore keeping her job safe. She then began collecting the clothes Robert was to wear. First she wrapped a soft leather corset about the young boy's waist, explaining, as she laced the front, that Diane said the corset will improve Robert's posture. Next was a pair of panties. Robert had never seen panties like these before. There were rows and rows of ruffles all over them, but the embarrassed young boy pulled them on. Jane then produced a frilly and flouncy slip with petticoats sewn to the waist. When Robert saw it, he wondered if he could run away now. But before he had time to contemplate the idea, Jane was assisting Robert into the slip. Jane picked up the dress from the bed and, after undoing the buttons, slipped it over Robert's head. Robert looked at his reflection as Jane fastened the buttons and saw the yellow satin dress, with short, puffed sleeves, sat delicately on the mass of petticoats. The wide red sash was tied about his waist into a huge bow, and Robert was relieved to take his eyes from the ridiculous reflection when Jane told him to sit on the bed. When he sat on the bed, the petticoats and skirt spread out in a circle, and Robert wondered how he was going to get out of this situation. Long white socks were pulled up his legs before Jane fitted short, shiny, black ankle boots to his feet. They had a 2-inch heel, and when Jane had finished lacing them, she took 2 yellow ribbons from the drawer of the dressing table and fitted them to the boots in a bow. Robert, with tears forming in his eyes, looked at the doll on the bed beside him and noticed it was dressed identical to him, including the yellow bows on its boots. Feeling dejected, Robert did nothing as Jane applied makeup to his face. Rouge was brushed on his cheeks and pink lipstick enhanced his lips, and then Jane fitted a blonde wig, with ringlets, to the boy's head. A yellow satin bow was clipped to each side of the wig, and Jane insisted that Robert looked at his reflection. As Robert stood unsteadily in the boots, he expected to see a 14-year-old boy in a silly dress, but what he saw was a 10-year-old girl in a silly dress. "I feel stupid, dressed like this," Robert told Jane. "And I feel stupid dressed like this," Jane said with a smile as the two of them looked at their reflections in the mirrored doors. They started to laugh, and Jane did a curtsy to her reflection. She then told Robert to curtsy as his aunt would expect it. For the next 15 minutes they laughed as they practiced their curtsies, and Robert began to relax, but Jane ended any enjoyment the boy had when she said, "Robert, it is time for you to go to breakfast with your aunt." Robert hung his head as Jane explained that she would have to call him Jessica when his aunt was about, and also he was to carry the doll at all times. "Don't worry," she continued, "this time next week you'll be well away from here and you can be a boy again." Robert walked unsteadily on his new heels, carrying the doll, and his skirt and petticoat swished with every step, but the boy had no idea of what the ladies had in store for him. Robert followed Jane into the dining room where his aunt sat regally at the head of the long table. "Good morning, Jessica," Diane said. "Good morning, Auntie," Robert said and curtsied, holding his skirt with one hand while the other held his doll. Diane and Jane smiled. Yes, his aunt was going to attend a fashion show in London next week, but Jessica was to be the new model and they had 6 days to train her.